Okay, so thanks again for coming and listening to my research. So my background is I'm an IT guy. I've spent most of my career in IT. I've worked for large corporations. I worked for BHP for a long time, ANZ Bank. I've been a consultant. I've worked for small vendor companies. I had a startup that hit the GFC and ruination and all of that kind of stuff. I've been a product manager and got a bit sick of IT, actually, after 30-odd years of that. And I thought, well, I'm getting on a bit. I'm a bookish kind of guy. I'll become a librarian, and that'll be a nice stress-free way to eke out my autumn years. So I went and did the graduate diploma in library studies at Monash, and I had such a good time there, so I turned that into a master's, and I did a sort of a minor piece of research. I was going to be looking at some research data preservation type stuff, but Joanne Evans had an interesting sounding project where she wanted someone to look at creating a reference model for interoperability between Australian series systems. So the idea that you could actually connect together the different state and maybe national archives and sort of share data and all that kind of stuff. So in my master's I had a look at doing that, and I think I sent around a link to a paper that came out of that, and found that yes, in fact, with a bit of tweaking, you could in fact do that. You could actually generate interoperability using the Australian series system. But there was a whole lot of problems doing that related to the way that we've conceptualised some of the metadata standards for that. And raised, like all good research, raised more questions than it answered. And I had such a good time doing my master's, so I'm doing my doctorate at the moment, and trying to answer some of those questions that came out of that master's research. And broadened to look beyond Australian series system and actually think about record keeping in the continuum sense. So that's records management and archival stuff, and trying to understand how we should conceptualise the infrastructure for record keeping in general. And one of the main things in informing that is the idea of participatory record keeping, the idea that sort of come out of the continuum stuff to say that there are many stakeholders in records, and what sort of infrastructure do we need to allow the various stakeholders to exercise the agency that they need in their records. So the idea that there's perhaps more than one creator, and whilst there may be a custodian, the idea of a single owner is kind of flawed as well. And so that, and also an understanding that in today's world, our systems are basically interconnected anyway. We have web interfaces. The world expects things to be networked. So trying to think about, if we think beyond collections and think we're actually in an interconnected world of records and metadata, how do we actually think about infrastructure to support that? So my research questions are really, can you design such a thing? If you can design such a thing, is it useful? And then, if it is a useful thing, what does it actually tell us about archival or record keeping theory and standards and all of that kind of stuff? Really looking at participatory record keeping infrastructure that meets the needs of all stakeholders, and how do we do this as a design thing. So I'm coming from a particular perspective. Interestingly, I've never worked as an archivist. I've never worked as a records manager. I've come in sort of on the side and spent the last few years coming up to speed. I find myself kind of invigorated again and intrigued. The whole question of record keeping or archival informatics is a really complex and interesting one. And I think, as a side question, I think we need to get more design type people involved in the archival world and trying to figure out that's something that Joanne and I are trying to think about, is how do we actually create a developer community in Australia. Richard Lehane's another one that's sort of sustainable and can have real input into this stuff. So Monash is actually pretty concerned records relating to people that have experienced out-of-home care. And that's, stolen generations, forced adoptions, child migration, anyone that's been through the system. There's been about 500,000 Australians in the last century or so that's come through those sort of systems in Australia. There's been more than 80 state and federal inquiries into the state of out-of-home care over the last 25 years. 80.
That's extraordinary.
Yeah. Each inquiry is a greater, and they're not all royal commissions, but there's been a number of significant royal commissions into this stuff. Each inquiry has identified systemic problems in record-keeping infrastructure, and in particular, the access to records by people that have been in care. And one of the main aspects of that is people that are trying to get their records, or access to the records, which are spread across multiple record holders, is a re-traumatising experience, because they're dealing with the same institutions, they have the same feeling of alienation and all of that kind of stuff. Each of these inquiries has made a number of recommendations for addressing these issues. And part of the reason for that is our infrastructure is limited. Our standards, and in particular the systems we employ, don't allow easily interoperability, federated search in any kind of meaningful way. How can we create this infrastructure that allows people to have agency in their records in the way that they feel they need to? So I started at the top left of this diagram, talking to some people, thinking, asking what do you expect from interoperability, how do you think this stuff should work? You know that Adrian's on the expert group on archival description, which is an international body looking at harmonising the ICA standards. So I went and spoke to a number of those people. I happened to be in Europe at the time, so I spoke to those people and other people in Australia. I then looked at the literature and sort of said, well, all the academics and practitioners that are publishing, what are they saying about participatory record keeping? What's the feeling there? And there was a whole lot of inconsistent and different views about what this means. I also did some ontological analysis. One of the hunches I had was that the way we build standards is from a very empirical kind of way. We look around us and we say, I can see organisations and agencies and records and series and things. So those should be my primary entities in my metadata standards. But there isn't actually hasn't been really a process of stepping back and saying, how should we actually be describing the world that we're trying to document in our records? One of my favourite quotes is from David Bierman, 25 years ago, who talked about instead of having our end users come to understand the world of documentation, we should be documenting the world of our end users, basically. So it's trying to flip that around. So from the ontological analysis, I did some conceptual modelling and came up with two models. A kind of a functional model that talks about how agency in records should be expressed, and a meta model for metadata. I'll briefly talk about the functional model, but the focus of today really is talking about the meta model for metadata, because that formed the basis of the system I built to exercise that metadata model. So me being an IT guy, I actually had to build a system to get twitchy if I don't code for a while. But I couldn't do everything, so what I really did was demonstrate the interoperability of this metadata meta model in a system. Now have been evaluating this system in all sorts of laboratory kind of ways, and I'm kind of back at the top now talking to experts, all of you, about the models and the system to get some feedback as whether you think it's a useful thing and if it adds something to the conversation about about trying to design these sort of systems.